Betaflight 4.3 full release is finally here, and I'm super excited. I know a lot of you guys are excited as well. I've been waiting a long time for this. I got into Betaflight 4.3 nightlies back in like August, September of last year, and I've been following along with all the release candidates since then. I know a lot of you guys were hesitant to try Betaflight 4.3 because it wasn't yet a stable full release, but here we are today with a full release now that is stable, and we can go ahead and hop into it. The whole point of this video is to help you set up a drone on Betaflight 4.3's firmware and to hopefully get a good, well-tuned drone to a point where you really enjoy flying it and you feel incredibly confident with it. I'm not the kind of person who likes to rely on stabilization of any kind, especially not for freestyle. It doesn't really matter if you're using Hypersmooth or Gyroflow or Real Steady or anything like that. I think because we flip and flop so much, there just isn't anything that can deal with that amount of movement and make it look natural. You're always going to get that weird concave look at the edges of the frame, and it just kind of gets a little too distorted, I think, for freestyle. If you're doing cinematic, then by all means, of course, that's totally okay to use stabilization software in that particular case. Or even if you're somebody who maybe flies with really slow rates and you don't really do too much really quick flipping and flopping, you probably get away with it then. But I like to move quickly, I like to do some juicy stuff, and in that particular case, I don't think stabilization really has a place for that style. And because of that, I care more about making sure I have a really well-tuned, good flying quad. Before we get into the configurator and put any software on the quad, we're actually going to talk about the quad itself. I cannot express to you guys how important it is to have the mechanicals of your quad in good order before you even spend any time trying to get into the tune. What you're looking for is a frame that has really good resonance characteristics, because what you don't want is a frame that has a lot of noise or additional vibrations that are happening because the motors are starting to spin up, and that in turn creates additional vibrations and things that the gyro has to worry about and filter out. The less filters you can have, the more the flight controller is going to worry about things like prop wash, things that matter, in order to get a much better feel and flight performance out of the quad. My personal favorite frames are Vega frames. I think Fred over at Vega does a lot of really great work as far as his designs. Everything is very well thought out and everything has its place, and it creates a very clean build that I think leads to having a really nice clean quad, easy to tune, and they just feel great. The center of gravity characteristics, the momentum you get out of these quads is amazing. They're great for juicy flying, especially if you're into things like spang. For sure, check out the Vega Spando. I love that frame. Hands down the best frame out there right now. This is the Vega One. This is essentially the Spando's little brother. I've been flying this for almost 2 weeks now, and I have to say I'm incredibly impressed. It's nice to have something similar to the Spando that's a little bit less expensive, more affordable, and has a lot of same design features and the same level of really great sound resonance characteristics that you're going to see in a minute when I show you my filters. I'm going to be using this quad to actually do the whole tuning process, so you'll be able to follow along with that. First thing we need to do is to get Betaflight's configurator on our computer so that we can put the firmware on the quad. If you have any older version of Betaflight's configurator currently on your computer, just go ahead and go to Add Remove Programs, Delete it, and delete any associated files with it. Just trust me on this, it's going to make the installation process for the new configurator much smoother. So the first thing we're going to want to do is get the Betaflight configurator on our computer so we can put the firmware on the flight controller. In order to do that, let's go ahead and head over to Betaflight's homepage, open up a web browser, type in Betaflight, and the first option should be their home. Scroll about halfway down the page and we're getting to the Getting Started section. Now, Betaflight's releases is over here on the right. It's going to take you to 430's release page, but we're looking for the configuration tool that can allow it to put it on the flight controller, so we are looking for latest configurator releases, and that's going to take us to 10.8.0. If you need to know which version you need for depending on your operating system, it's right here at the very top. I'm using Windows, so I'm going to need Win64.exe. Scroll down to the very bottom, and I'm going to click that installer for Win64.exe. Once the download is complete, and again, we've already deleted any other previous version of Betaflight Configurator off our computer, we go ahead and double click that exe folder or file. I recommend installing for all users, but that's up to you. And when this page, or when this warning pops up asking you if you want to do this, then select yes, speak English, click accept the agreement, and click next, depending on where it is that you want to go ahead and install. Mine says, would you like to install a folder anyway? I say yes, click next, install. This process is fairly quickly. If you don't uninstall prior, this process could drag on really long and make the install take forever. Now that the install is finished, the checkbox for starting a configurator immediately is checked. I'm going to go ahead and do that and click finish because I want it to open. And the very first thing I do is pin it down to my taskbar. If you want to make your Betaflight look like mine, meaning the dark theme, over here on the left-hand side is the options. Always permanently enable expert mode, highly recommend. Advanced CLI autocomplete, also highly recommend. And enable dark theme is turned on in order to get yours to look like mine. Grab a USB cable, connect it to your flight controller. If your flight controller is having a hard time being recognized by your PC, then what you're going to want to do is look at this little section here on Betaflight's homepage to get some additional drivers that you might need depending on if you're running like a really old flight controller or something along those lines. You can also try ImpulseRC Driver Fixer, which may also help that situation. I'll include a link to that in the description below. What you want to see is a COM port populate, and then we're going to go ahead and click connect. First thing I recommend is going over to the CLI, type in the words diff all, and then save that file somewhere where you can gain access to it later. The biggest reason why you want to save your CLI is for a couple of reasons. The main one is if you try 4.3 and if for some reason it's not working out, you can always go back to that old version of firmware you were using and just copy paste your CLI into this tab right here and click save, and you should be right back to where you were before. Another thing that I like using the CLI for is it helps make up the setup process much smoother and a little bit faster. You'll see what I mean in just a second. So now that we've done that, you can click on any one of these tabs. It'll go ahead and take you out of the CLI, but you do have to reconnect. So in order to put the firmware onto the flight controller, it needs to be in what's called DFU bootloader mode. In order to get to that mode, you can do a couple of things. On this very first page under the setup tab, you can see activate bootloader mode, and you can click that and it should put the flight controller right into bootloader mode. When you go to the update firmware section and you click load online firmware and click flash firmware, it should automatically put the flight controller into DFU bootloader mode right then and there. The other option you can try doing is completely unplug your USB cable, hold down the boot button on your flight controller, and while it's being held down, plug your USB cable in, and that should also put it into DFU mode. So let's go ahead and update the firmware. Go ahead and click on the update firmware selection here at the top, and what I recommend is you go ahead and either on this drop-down menu select releases or releases and release candidates. Since we're looking for 4 releases now, it doesn't really matter which one you select as long as it says releases. And this really great feature with the new configurator is to auto-detect whatever flight controller you're using. I'm using a T-Motor F7 flight controller, which is what auto-populated, and it automatically populated the most recent firmware for this flight controller, which is the full 4.3.0. Since we're going from a release candidate version, or this is also especially true if you're coming from like 4.2 going to 4.3, I highly recommend you do full chip erase. If you don't, you're likely going to run into issues down the road, such as I didn't click this option when I set up my controller, and once I turned everything on and tried to arm the quad, it took off like crazy. This could have been why. So do a full chip erase, and we're going to have to set everything up from scratch. If you're connected to the internet, you should be able to click load firmware online, and it's going to automatically put the latest firmware loaded into your computer, ready to go, and you'll select flash firmware. Now as you can see, my flight controller went immediately into DFU bootloader mode without me having to do any additional steps. If you are one of those people who have to either first connect and then hit activate DFU mode on that very first setup screen, try that first. If not, unplug the flight controller via the USB cable, hold the bootloader mode button down, and then plug the flight controller back in with the USB cable. It should be in DFU mode. Programming is successful. That's what we want to see. Go ahead and click connect, and the very first thing it's going to tell you is that it wants to apply custom defaults. Hit yes. Apply custom defaults. Make sure that your flight controller auto-populates with the COM port, and then you're going to click connect. Depending on your flight controller, you're going to get this warning pop up. This is telling me that I need to select a motor output protocol because one's not automatically selected via the flight controller firmware, and I also need to calibrate the accelerometer. So close this, calibrate accelerometer, done. I'm going to go down to the motors tab, and because I know that I'm running a BLHeli32 ESC that is capable of bidirectional D-shot, I am going to go here to my motor protocol, select D-Shot 600, and I'm going to go ahead and enable bidirectional D-Shot right now. Make sure that if you're going to do this, you have an ESC that can support bidirectional D-Shot. If you're running an older ESC that's using BLHeli-S, then you may not be able to use bidirectional D-Shot. If you're using at least BlueJ, then you probably can. You're definitely going to want to consult with your ESC manufacturer documentation to know for sure if you're capable of running bidirectional D-Shot. I'm always going to be running BLHeli-32 ESCs, and I know for a fact I can run bidirectional D-Shot, and I'm going to do it using D-Shot 600. So click Save and Reboot here at the bottom. Once we go ahead and reconnect, we're going to go over to the Ports tab. If you are the one who happened to build your drone, so you know exactly which UART you've put your serial receiver on and whatever your VTX output is, then you can go ahead and select those options now. This is one of the reasons why I really like using CLI, because I can just go into my CLI file, find my serial outputs, copy, come back into the CLI, and paste, enter, type save, enter, reconnect, and look at my ports now. I currently have my UART1 set up for my serial receiver, which is my TBS tracer, and I have UART2 as my MSP output protocol for my DJI output. If you happen to be one of those people who's using an F4 processor, whether it's an F405 or an F411, it's recommended by the Betaflight devs that you use a 4K PID loop versus 8K. You might be able to get away with 8K if you overclock, but that's kind of getting into some more advanced stuff, and it's not something I'm going to recommend right now. I'm using an F7 processor, and I highly recommend that you do as well. If that's the case, you should be able to run 8K PID loop, no issues whatsoever, and still maintain a fairly relative low CPU load. If you trying to bump that up to 8K on an F4, you might get into issues where you have an overload of the CPU usage. I personally don't use accelerometer, barometer, or magnometer. If you want to use those, that's up to you. You're going to need to have accelerometer enabled if you want to do angled or horizon level mode fly of any kind. Put in your craft name. I use my motors as beepers in the event that I happen to crash into a tree or in some really thick bush of some kind and I can't find my quad. I either set up a beeper switch on my controller, or I want to know if I happen to lose my transmission from my radio to my quad that it's also going to start beeping. So in order to get that, I select these two options. I don't personally leave air mode enabled all the time. I put air mode on a switch, but that's up to you. We're going to click Save and Reboot. Under Power and Battery, I've always gone in here and changed this to 4.35. I think this was based on like an old Joshua Barwell recommendation, which I've always done and just never not done it. And I've never had any issues with my OSD displaying the correct voltage, so I'm just going to keep doing it. Presets tab. This is where I do like using the Presets tab, and it's specifically in regards to my RC Link. I'm using Tracer. And click this first drop-down menu. Click on the option that says specifically RC Link. As you can see, there's a lot of options in here, and so far the ones I've tested were Tracer, Crossfire, and ExpressLRS 250 Hz, and they've all been pretty excellent in my experience. Going down and finding TBS Tracer 250 Hz, click that. There's the options here. Click that drop-down menu, and I'm doing HD Freestyle since I'm using DJI. Click Pick, and Save and Reboot. Again, this is going to be dependent on whatever receiver you're using. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below, and I can help guide you in the right point. But I definitely recommend using presets for your receiver for reasons of RC smoothing, so on and so forth. This is how you're going to get a really nice clean feel from your stick inputs into the receiver. So let's go ahead and move over to the PID Tuning Tab. And this is where we're going to start kind of getting into our just initial setup of how we're going to set up the drone to get prepared for the later tuning process. First thing I always do whenever I know I'm going to set up a drone for tuning is I turn dynamic dampening all the way to 0. It never comes back. I'm not a fan of dynamic dampening at all. If you are, then by all means, it's up to you to go ahead and try to use it and see if you like it. For tuning purposes, I also turn stick response all the way to 0 because when you're using PID Toolbox, if you have feed-forward gains on, you tend to see a little bit weird traces on PID Toolbox, so it's best if you just leave those off for now and we can come back and put in some feed-forward later. I also, having had as much experience as I have had, multiple flight controllers, different ESC combinations, different motor setups, But specifically talking about F7 flight controllers, I've done it with a few F4 flight controllers, BL Heli 32 ESCs, 5-inch drones, and I'm always using a GoPro, so mine is always on when I'm doing my tuning process. Highly recommend you fly your drone doing your tuning process the same way you would normally fly, which means put a GoPro on, use the same props you're planning on using. I even recommend using props that are a little bit beat up, not like perfectly fresh props. But with all that in mind, I always start out with a master multiplier of 1.4. As long as you've made sure that your quad is well built, it's a good frame, there's good motors, good hardware being used, and you put the correct firmware on there, you should not have any issue whatsoever using these current settings I'm recommending to you right now, specifically with the 1.4 master multiplier. Since we already went ahead and used the presets to take care of our PID controller area for the most part, this has to do with some jitter reduction, smoothness, so on and so forth. That was all done when I did my preset for the TBS tracer using the RC Link preset. I highly recommend you don't really mess with too much of this stuff. You can get into more iTerm Relax if you really want to go down the road of having to get even deeper into the tuning process, but again, not necessary with 4.3. As far as I've experienced, these settings that are currently here along with the preset I've used, I've never had any issues to go ahead and tweak any of that stuff. What I do tend to tweak is because I run 48 kilohertz PWM frequency on my ESC, I use thrust linearization at 25%. I've tried flying without it so many times, and I've noticed that there's just something not quite right. When I fly on 24 kilohertz PWM, it's not nearly as noticeable and it's not a big deal, but because I love the smoothness and efficiency of 48 kilohertz, you guys know I love flying as smooth as possible. When I put thrust linearization at 25% here, it just tends to have much better low throttle control, and I don't get any weird oscillations or anything that I've noticed in the past without it. So that's why I use it. Dynamic idle value was something in the past that a lot of people didn't really want to tweak because it had to do with a little bit more calculations on where you wanted to stick this value. But in Betaflight 4.3, they've made it much simpler to use this feature by just sort of kind of going based off of an already predetermined amount that you want to use depending on the props you're using. I believe it was Chris Rosser who perfectly highlighted this, and he said somewhere about the 5-inch prop length, you're going to look for about a 20 value is what you'd want to use, and then you can go up from there based on the pitch, so on and so forth. So my personal recommendation, if I'm going to be using the peanut butter and jelly ethics props, which a lot of people do fly, I usually have a value of about 20 to 25 with those. That's a 5.1 inch prop at a pitch of 3. If I'm going to be using props that I would normally use for my style of flying, which is a little bit more juicy, I usually use props that are about 4.9 inch in length and at a pitch of about 4.36, 4.35. And with those types of props, like the ones I'm going to be planning on flying on this drone, I usually stick to about 30, 35. So knowing that, I'm going to go ahead and put in a value of 30 right now. And click save. Rateprofile settings. I have been sticking with a TPA breakpoint of 1550. I leave my TPA at 0.65. You can leave this at the default, which is 1350, and I bet you probably won't really even notice much of a difference whatsoever. Another reason why I really like depending on my CLI is because I don't like to put my rates in every time. I just go to the CLI here at the very bottom. I just go to my rate profile, copy, pasta that whole thing, go back into CLI, paste, save. And you'll see once we go back into the rate profile tab that my rates are currently selected. I use Betaflight rates. Here are the rates that I'm currently using, and that also would have automatically set up my TPA breakpoint too. Over here in the filter settings tab, again, going back to the mechanicals of the drone, I know I spend a lot of time making sure the drone is built really well, everything is soldered well, and I don't have any crazy dangly things going on that's going to create any additional vibrations. I know my motors are fairly new, so the bearings are good. Because of that, I'm going to go ahead and shut off gyro low pass filters. Most 5-inch quads that I've experienced in all the different quads that I've built, I can get away with turning these filters off immediately and never have to worry about turning them back on. If you're flying something that's much larger, you may need gyro low pass filtering, but this particular guide is about freestyle 5-inch quads. Gyro RPM filters, the meat and potatoes of the filters you're going to be using with this current setup. So everything else for now we'll go ahead and leave as default until we actually take a look at a log, and then we'll make changes based on what we see in the logs. Click Save. So the next thing we're going to want to do is make sure that our receiver is actually working, so we're going to go over to the Receiver tab. Depending on your flight controller, the 5 volts from the USB cable being plugged in might be enough to make your receiver work through your flight controller. It's not always true in every case. In my particular case, I'm going to have to plug in a battery in order to get the receiver to start being powered up and it can connect to my controller. You don't want to leave this plugged in for too long, so we're going to try to go through this quickly. But as you can see, it powered it on, and I'm actually having my roll, pitch, and yaw function when I actually move the sticks. So this is going to be my throttle, my yaw, my pitch, and my roll. Everything is working as it should be. And my aux switches, check those as well. If you need help with setting up controller stuff, that's a completely different topic for a different video. That's something you're probably going to want to look up online, or just check out Joshua Bardwell's page. If you do have any questions though, feel free to drop in the comments and I'll definitely do my best to help you out. The only things I change on this page, and you don't have to do this at all if you don't want to, but I change my high-low threshold. And because I like to see my LQ and my OSD of my DJI goggles, I actually turn on the RSSI channel to aux 8. I have it set up through that channel on my receiver, and I'm able to see the readout for the LQ in my on-screen display. It was something I did from like an old Joshua Bardwell recommendation video. I don't even know if I have to do that anymore. I just still set it up that way. Either way, it works, so I'm going to keep doing it. Because you used the preset that you had for your selected receiver, you shouldn't have to go and change anything in RC smoothing. But if you did make any changes on this page, just go ahead and click Save. The next thing we're going to go to is modes, and depending on how you want to set that up, it's completely up to you. It's really easy. You're going to add a range, so for instance ARM, and the first thing you hit is going to automatically detect, so it changed it to aux 2, and I like to have mine high. Beeper, I'm going to add range, and that's my aux 4, and I like to have that all the way high, so I'm going to do that. Next one is air mode for me. Again, if you have it enabled all the time, this won't even be an option you can see. But I like my air mode to be on both medium and high. Last one is flip over on crash, which is also known as eternal mode. That's going to be my aux 3, and that's also high. Click Save. So you want to make sure that your stuff is working. Air mode, ARM, beeper, and turn mode. Through the magic of digital video editing, I have removed my props because the next step it is very important that you do for safety reasons. I have never, ever gone into the Motors tab with my props on my quad. So let's go ahead and click on the Motors tab. First thing I'm going to do is select the option for motor direction is reversed. I particularly fly with props out. I like to fly around trees a lot, as you've probably seen, and for me, flying props out is a no-brainer. You are much more likely to sort of bounce off, deflect off of a branch than if you are flying props in, which will for sure go right into the middle of the drone and get you stuck in a tree. That's why I fly it with props out reverse. I'm going to go ahead and click Save because it is going to kick me out and I'm going to get right back in. The next thing we're going to do is get into motor configuration. This is one of the added features with Betaflight 4.3 Configurator 10.8.0 is to be able to reorder the motors right here and very simply using a wizard. So we're going to go ahead and plug our battery back in. I'm going to click on Reorder Motors, and I understand I have removed my props. Click Start. It's going to immediately start spinning a motor, and whatever it is, the motor that's spinning is the one that you're going to select. So my back right motor is the one spinning. Next motor is the front right, back left, and front right. And click Save. Again, that should kick you out. Go right back in, right into the Motors tab. And now we're going to look at motor direction. This is also a really nice feature with 10.8.0's configurator. I understand the risk. I personally like to do individually. I hit a motor and I'm looking at which direction it's spinning. Okay, that one's out. 2 is also out. 3 should be out. If for any reason you needed to change this up from whatever the defaults were, you can either select normal or reverse depending on the motor you have selected, and it will swap between normal and reverse direction, and then you're good to go. Just for making sure everything is working correctly, I usually go here to this section, click this option, and then I just rev them all up, make sure I'm not getting any errors. And everything seems to be running and spinning smoothly. Okay, now you can unplug the quad. The next tab is OSD, and if you've never set up your OSD, I highly recommend you get in here and set some things up however you like. You can move them around this particular screen to see how it will actually orient. You can even plug in your goggles and see it happening in real time. Again, I use DJI goggles. I will just go into my CLI and find my OSD settings, copy, and paste those into my CLI. And once I reconnect, go to my OSD, and I should have my elements that I like to have where they should be. Don't worry about video transmitters, sensors, tethered logging. I don't use any of those features. I will go down into Blackbox because I know for sure the first thing I'm going to do is make a log, and I'm going to look at the log to help me do my tune. So onboard flashing is my option. Depending on your flight controller, I recently just did a tune for one of my subscribers. They didn't have any onboard flashing. They had an SD card slot, but the SD card slot wasn't working. I still did the tune without having to do any logging. I did it by ear and feel, but this is the best way to get a really good tune, to be able to make logs. This is how you do it. Onboard flash, if you have that option. If it's SD card, put an SD card in and use that as the option. I'm going to stay at 2 kilohertz as far as the frequency that I'm going to log at. 2 kilohertz is going to be good for looking at your filters. I just keep it on 2 kilohertz. You can go to 1 kilohertz if you're just doing PID tuning in PID Toolbox, but I just use 2 kilohertz for both. It works out just fine for me. The most important thing is you want to use this drop-down menu to go to gyro scale. And click save and reboot. So now when I go out flying, it's going to start recording logs, and it's going to fill up this free space here. What you can do is when you create a log, you're going to come back in here, click activate mass storage device. It's going to open up a window, then you can click and drag the log out of it, or you can copy the log out of it, put it somewhere, open it up in Blackbox Explorer and take a look at it that way, or open it using PID Toolbox. We'll look at that in just a second. That concludes my initial setup of my drone. Before you take it outside to start doing any sort of logging, I highly recommend you do a test hover in a nice safe location just to make sure that the quad is responding the way it should. Put the props back on, put a battery in, go somewhere safe, and just do like a little quick forward pitch, reverse pitch, slight roll to the left, slight roll to the right, and you can see the quad just kind of sort of moving along the ground, not doing any crazy stuff. If you happen to try to do this test hover and you just do those little slow movements, and the quad immediately flips out, that means you do not have your motor orientation correct, or you have your props on incorrectly. So now that we've set up Betaflight 4.3 on our flight controllers, many of you are ready to go out there and fly this quad, and you're probably going to think it feels completely locked and really good the way it is. The defaults are especially great if you aren't intending to fly with a full-size GoPro or anything like that. Most of you are probably perfectly fine with how the drone feels right now. If that's you, then by all means, keep flying and have fun. If you're anything like me and you like to squeeze as much performance out of your drone as possible, then by all means, please follow along with the rest of the video. I'm going to get into my tuning process and show you how you can try to get an even better flying and performing quad than you already currently have.